Great to have you all. Shabbat Shalom. I did a funeral at one point for a family with Russian heritage. They came from Russia. And in Russia, they taught me that there is a tradition of pouring a whole bottle of vodka on the grave at somebody's funeral. And the family looked at me when I was meeting with them before the funeral and said, Rabbi, our mother didn't really like vodka, but she really loved Pellegrino. Can we pour a bottle of Pellegrino? Sure, why not? So they did, and I started sharing that story with different families if it was appropriate to meet with. And it turns out that Phyllis has been visiting Jack's grave every month and taking one shot of scotch and pouring it on there for him. And I think it's a beautiful, that was something, I used to have a shot with Jack every week at Shabbat, as long as he was here. And if Phyllis wasn't around, I would pour him a second one. He'd say, don't tell her. I said, okay, I'm not going to. But now it's not our secret anymore. But anyway, I look forward to all joining in a l'chaim in Jack's memory. And we miss him. And we're glad that his whole family is here to be with us today. I want to wish a happy anniversary to Felicia and Saul Kolbfeld, Jacqueline and Neil Goldstein, Karen and Max Emmer, Judy and Barry Eisenberg, and a happy birthday to Sylvia Wolf, Carolyn Fine, Eleanor Reamer, Julia Keller, Hannah Carroll, Zoe Nathanson, Sarah Seid, and Thea Seid. Happy birthday and Mazel Tov to everybody. I want to thank, of course, our Torah readers today, Dennis Deutsch, Shauna Kantor, Chuck Barris, our Haftorah reader, Jack Light, davening this morning, starting off with Stephen Rabinovitz, and then Mark Roth. Closing out, our closing pitcher today will be Mark Sussman. And thank you, everybody. Our floor captain was Larry Gunsberg, our Gavai on the Bima, Gordy Barris, our digital Gavais, Harold Canna and Mark Bettman. Thank you, everybody, for helping out and making services what they are. Some of what I'm going to say today, if taken in small sound bites and not in the larger context of my message, could be upsetting or make people feel uncomfortable. I want to say that from the outset. I want to ask that you hear the entire message and don't take little snippets and say, can you believe the rabbi said this? Because it will miss the entire message. The question before us has to do with the concept or the struggle of how do we form relationships and even friendships with those who might hold beliefs that are antithetical to what we ourselves believe. And I don't mean disagreements about little nuances, but I mean big issues that go against fundamental key parts of our identity. This week, I was fortunate to be able to attend my very first in-person conference since the pandemic. I and about 200 plus other rabbis, some people sounds like a nightmare, but it was wonderful. We attended the Rabbinical Assembly Convention in St. Louis. One evening, there was a panel assembled, and on the panel were two rabbis and two members of the Christian clergy who, despite some serious differences, had developed an amazingly strong and mutually supportive relationships. These relationships grew out of the horrific situation with the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri on August 9th, 2014. For what I have to say today, the facts surrounding that shooting are not really relevant at all. And there's still debate. The police officer involved was acquitted on every possible charge that people tried to bring. And I read as much as I could, and I'll leave that out because it's not relevant. But what grew out of his death was a number of protests, some peaceful and some not peaceful, and they lasted several weeks. But what's of interest is the relationships that grew out of those protests. Rabbi Noah Arno, a conservative rabbi in St. Louis, was sitting on the bima for his very first Shabbat as the rabbi of Kol Rinah when the shooting occurred. And after Shabbat, he heard about the protests. Wasn't sure, as a brand new rabbi in the congregation, in the community, if he should attend. He did go to a few of the peaceful marches that were specifically organized by clergy as an interfaith support of peace. There, at one of those marches, he met Pastor Carlos Smith. Pastor Smith, a self-described 6'8", 300-pound African-American brother, and Rabbi Arno began a relationship that led to them eventually sharing a building for congregations as they each found new buildings and space. And eventually, Rabbi Arno and Pastor Smith took a trip to Israel together and still remain good friends, learning Bible, Psalms in the summer. They held a program together. They learn still to this day, once a week. Rabbi Susan Talvi, a staunch social justice warrior and the founding rabbi of Central Synagogue in St. Louis, was leading services when she heard about the protests. As a social justice advocate, she knew she needed to be there as soon as she could after services. Pastor Tracy Blackman, who's known as a leader in the African-American civil rights and justice world, was there. Upon hearing of the shooting of another young black man, Pastor Blackman dropped what she was doing and drove to the scene. When she showed up at the scene where Michael Brown's body was laying in the street 3 and 4 hours after he'd been shot, she was livid, but she knew she had to be that calming force in the crowd of angry protesters. And it was at that moment she needed somebody to be her partner. And it was at that moment that Rabbi Susan Talvi showed up. Together, they brought a sense of calm to what could have been violent and angry. Since then, they've become self-described soul sisters. They don't agree on everything. On the bima, Rabbi Susan Talvi looked at her soul sister and said, "I still don't get this whole thing of a guy dying for my sins." And the pastor shot back, "And I don't get all these fake stories you call midrash that you keep telling me actually happened when they're not in the Bible." They didn't agree on everything. But the protests, they were there together. But these protests were difficult for the Jewish community. They were difficult because through these protests, some of the first to really happen in a live streamed fashion, they were streamed, people with their cameras not just taking pictures, but loading them up at the same moment, spread around the world. And when they were doing that, a connection was made between those protesting on the streets of St. Louis for racial justice and Palestinian youth who grew up fighting against what they felt was similar with the unjust occupation of their homeland. Through a number of live streaming platforms, Palestinians began advising the protesters on how to defeat police tactics based on their years of conflict with Israeli defense forces. Many in the African-American community began to feel a sense of deep connection with Palestinian freedom fighters and became advocates for what they understood as their struggle for racial justice against the oppressive white regime. Their words. As the panel at the RA convention continued, both Pastor Smith and Pastor Blackman continued to refer to what I would call the Palestinian territories as the state of Palestine, which made us uncomfortable in that room. And despite their trips together to Israel, both pastors continued to see a connection between their fights for racial justice being parallel to that of the Palestinian people. So the moderator asked them, Judaism, for us Jews, Zionism is essential to our identity. How do you overcome this in your relationships? Pastor Blackman told the following story. On the 3-year anniversary of the death of Michael Brown, there was to be a major event with thousands in attendance at a major arena, some of the top speakers on racial justice from around the country. Pastor Blackman was to be on that panel as a moderator, to be as a moderator. And Rabbi Talvi was to be one of the speakers. A few hours before the event, Blackman arrived and noticed that Rabbi Talvi was not there. She was also not answering her phone. Pastor Blackman asked the organizer in the arena, "Where is Rabbi Talvi? Why isn't she here?" And she was simply told Rabbi Talvi couldn't make it. Pastor Blackman, being resourceful, eventually got hold of Rabbi Talvi's assistant, who informed her that Rabbi Talvi was asked to step away from the panel because of the protest of the Palestinian delegation. Furious, Pastor Blackman marched over to the event organizer, who confessed this was the truth, and said, the Palestinians said, if there's a Zionist here, we aren't coming. And Rabbi Talvi is an ardent but liberal Zionist. Pastor Blackman declared 90 minutes before this major event was to go on that if Rabbi Talvi was not on the stage, she was not on the stage. They called Rabbi Talvi eventually and asked her to come. And Rabbi Talvi was hesitant, but she said out of her friendship for Pastor Blackman, she would come. At that point, Rabbi Talvi said the following: when we are willing to sacrifice the child of Hagar, which means the stranger or the other person, but is also spelled the same as Hagar, when we are willing to sacrifice the child of Hagar, it's not surprising that soon after we'll be willing to sacrifice our own child. Let me say that again. When we're willing to sacrifice the child of Hagar, it's not surprising that soon after we'll be willing to sacrifice our own child. In this week's Torah portion, at the insistence of Sarah, his wife, and the reassurance of God, Abraham sends his first son, Ishmael, and his mother, Hagar, the stranger, into the wilderness, an almost certain death in the desert. And in the immediate next chapter, God tells Abraham to take his only son and sacrifice him on an altar. This is a difficult idea to swallow. The idea that perhaps God was actually pushing Abraham further and further to see how far he would go. Well, you sacrifice that one by just sending him out into the desert. Let's see if you'll do it firsthand. It's a difficult idea. And it's not the basic surface meaning of the text at all. But the idea that if we don't take care of the stranger, are we going to be able to take care of ourselves as well? It's a difficult idea, but sometimes those ideas, those difficult ideas, are the ones that allow us to grow. They allow us to stretch ourselves. And perhaps it's wrestling with such ideas that make us who we are. We are Yisrael, the people who continually wrestle with God and come out not just surviving, but thriving and that much stronger. Shabbat Shalom.